Well, before in Oklahoma gardening, we've stressed the importance of proper sprayer and spreader calibration. However, proper application procedure is just as important. And with us today is Dr. Dennis Martin. He's the Turfgrass Extension Specialist here at OSU, and he's going to explain some of the proper application procedures and some of the goofs that have happened. And Dennis, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm pleased to be on the show. Here we have the fertilizer goof plots, and these allow us to learn about proper and improper fertilizer application. You know, we can have the fertilizer spreader calibrated properly and we can be walking at the proper ground speed, but yet we can still have poor technique that really shows up in some embarrassing goofs on our lawns. And this is an excellent time to take a look at the correct and incorrect way to make the application.
Now here we've got one that looks pretty good.
That's right. This is the proper way to have made an application. These were put on just a little bit over 2 weeks ago, a nitrogen-containing fertilizer. And if you look at the plots, you can see the application was made very uniformly. We had the proper ground speed, proper calibration, but most importantly with the drop spreader, we had the proper pass alignment so that we didn't have any skips or excessive overlaps.
Okay. Now right next here, the grass is much lighter than that. Why is this?
That's correct. This area here has not received a fertilizer application, and you can see the difference between no nitrogen fertilizer application and actually 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, which is suggested in the OSU fact sheets as one of the applications.
Okay. Now this has more of a striped look to it. What happened here?
This is the actual first one of the goof plots, and there are several plots that we'll be taking a look at. This application to this plot, as well as the correctly done one, was made with a drop type spreader, but what the applicator here failed to do was properly align the successive passes, or in other words, we did not butt the hopper passes up against each other. We put the wheel track of one pass in the wheel track of another, but yet there was 2 inches between the opening on the bottom of the gate and the wheel. So we had a 4-inch band that actually did not receive fertilizer here. And even though some of the fertilizer melted over and went into that band, you can still see some very light green, apple green strips here that did not receive the proper rate. And these can be very embarrassing for us, as well as the turf isn't as healthy because it didn't receive the proper application rate of fertilizer.
Okay. Now here we've got kind of the opposite thing going on. What happened here?
With this plot here, what we intentionally did was overlap too much. Now, because we've been 2 weeks since the application, the first few days after the application, we actually had a minor burn where we had too much overlap. So in other words, there was one area of the plot that received the proper application, and where we overlapped too much, we actually had 2 times the rate, which was excessive. It caused a salting out effect or a burn on the turf. The turf has since healed, but you'll see undulations now where that excessive amount of fertilizer is causing an overstimulation of the turf. So we don't have a very uniform appearance. We have a normal fertilized appearance and then excessive dark green and excessive hills because of excessive growth from too much nitrogen being applied.
Okay. Now this actually looks pretty good here in the middle, but what happened on this plot?
Okay, we did have proper technique out here in the main part of the plot, but the mistakes that were made on this plot is actually back at the ends of both sides. For instance, in this case, the applicator opened the gate on the hopper of the fertilizer spreader before having had the proper ground speed. What we want the applicator to do is actually start walking at the proper speed, then open the gate, and as you get to the end of the pass, stop movement and stop the gate at the same time. Never turn the spreader a sharp turn like this, a 180-degree turn with the spreader open, because you're pivoting, and on the inside of that pivot there'll be excessive amount of fertilizer put down, and you can see some of the burns on both ends that were caused by starting with actually standing still and the gate was open before you were moving, and also at the end where we were pivoting. So if you get into tight situations near a curb or near a building and you find a problem with picking up proper ground speed before you open the gate, you can actually make a couple of parallel passes at the ends of the property or near the building that allow you an area so that when you come back in the other direction, you'll be able to pick up your proper ground speed before opening the gate, and you can avoid this type of problem.
Okay. Now in this plot it has kind of a checkerboard effect to it. What did we do here?
Okay. Many times in our fact sheets and our educational seminars We tell folks to split the material to be applied and put it on at a half rate in 2 directions, and that helps out with distribution. And that's oftentimes very good to do when spreading seed, because even though we might not get the full rate on there, we still get some amount of seed. But as you can see, unless the technique is done properly, even that type of method to try to compensate for mistakes does not produce as good of an effect as the properly done plot. So we put half the rate down in one direction, but if we didn't have proper budding of the passes together, we're going to have skips in one direction, then we come back in the other direction to put the rest of the material on. We'll have a few skips, a few overlaps in that case, and that actually, instead of just producing simple striping like we saw earlier, produces a checkerboard effect that you see here. So it really can't compensate for bad technique.
Okay, so it is important to get that technique down right.
That's correct.
So, now what happened with this plot?
Okay, with this plot here, as you can see, we are on a slope, and what we tried to illustrate here was the cases where folks have a extreme sloping lawn and they make a decision to fertilize by going up and down the slope rather than across the slope. So what happens, and this is also confounded by if you're putting too much fertilizer in a spreader and really weighting it down, it becomes a great deal of work to climb up the hill with the spreader, and you're going kind of slow, so you're putting down quite a bit of material. As you get to the top of the hill and you start your pass down, actually you may be chasing the spreader down because it's very heavy, and then you changed your ground speed and you're walking faster, in some instances running. There you're under applying the fertilizer. So going up the hill where you're going slow, you'll see a dark green stripe, excessive growth. Coming down the slope where you were going very fast, you actually didn't apply enough fertilizer, and it's a lighter green in appearance, and it really may have under applied the fertilizer, and you can see the striping effect here. Oh. The better technique to have used if it's an extreme slope is to have gone perpendicular to the slope. That way gravity wouldn't be affecting your passes near as much, because you would be going in this direction in this case rather than up and down the slope.
Okay. Now this final plot here doesn't necessarily look like fertilizer damage. It looks more like a spray.
That's correct. What we were trying to emphasize here is proper technique using a spot sprayer, maybe just to spot out some crabgrass or some Dallas grass, or for broadleaf weeds for that matter. So the herbicide in this case doesn't matter, but what was done improperly here was that the applicator chose to spray to the complete point of runoff on the weed, and that's really not necessary. If we have our hand pump up sprayers calibrated properly for a broadcast sprayer, but because we're trying to reduce our pesticide use rate and just spot out the weeds that are there, we just want a quick snap of the nozzle, and that would put down the proper rate. We do not want to spray to the point of complete wetting or complete runoff, because that causes an over application. And as you can see here, we have burn of the turf, and it'll actually take well over a month for these areas to heal up because of the excess application.
Okay. Well, Dennis, I really appreciate you. This is a very visual look at how improper application procedure can mess up our lawn.